All right, let's dive into a real chilling case, the mystery of the Boston Strangler. 13 single women murdered in Boston between 1962 and 1964.
And it's still debated even today.
It is, yeah. No signs of forced entry, victims of all ages and backgrounds. It really had the whole city on edge, wondering if it was just one person behind it all. And then we have Albert DeSalvo, the man who confessed. But even that comes with,
A whole heap of questions.
yeah, a whole heap of questions, contradictions. So today, we're going to be sifting through DeSalvo's confession. We're going to be examining those alternative theories. And we're even going to uncover some surprising DNA evidence that emerged in 2013.
It's a case, it really highlights how chilling the unknown can be. Just imagine the fear that gripped Boston at the time.
Oh, yeah. And the press even had a bunch of different names for this unknown assailant. The Mad Strangler of Boston, the Phantom Fiend. It just added to that feeling that anyone could be next to.
The seeming randomness of the victims really amplified that terror. It wasn't just young women or women of a certain profession being targeted. The victims ranged in age from their 20s to their 80s. Different backgrounds, different neighborhoods. It created the sense of vulnerability that really resonated throughout the city. People were buying tear gas, changing their locks. Some even moved away. It's a stark reminder of how quickly fear can just permeate a community when faced with the unknown.
Let's talk about those early days. The first few murders that really set off that panic. The first victim linked to the Boston Strangler was Anna Slessors, a 55-year-old woman found in her apartment on Gainsborough Street. And then, just a couple weeks later, 85-year-old Mary Mullen was found murdered in her apartment on Commonwealth Avenue.
And it wasn't just the age difference that puzzled investigators. There were inconsistencies in the crime scenes, too. Some women were strangled manually, others with ligatures. And this lack of a consistent modus operandi, MO, led some experts, even at the time, to believe that they might be dealing with multiple killers.
Okay, so right from the start, there's this cloud of uncertainty. But the murders kept happening. In June of 62, we have Mina Nichols, 68, and Helen Blake, 65. Then August brought two more victims, Iderga, 75, and Jane Sullivan, 67. It really felt like nowhere was safe.
And the authorities were struggling to keep up. Imagine trying to coordinate an investigation across multiple jurisdictions, with different police departments, all working under immense pressure to find the person or people responsible.
It sounds chaotic. And all this while, the media frenzy is growing, the public is demanding answers. It must have been incredibly difficult to maintain a clear focus with all that noise.
Absolutely. And then in December of 62, we have a case that really underscores the killer's audacity. 20-year-old Sophie Clark, found strangled in her apartment on Huntington Avenue.
What's so striking about that one?
Her apartment was just steps away from a police station.
Wow, that's chilling. It's like a direct challenge, almost like a taunt, almost.
It certainly suggests a level of confidence, maybe even a desire to flaunt their ability to evade capture. It's a detail that has fueled speculation ever since.
Just a few weeks after Sophie Clark's murder, on December 31st, we have another victim, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett. Again, no signs of forced entry, and the cause of death was strangulation.
And the murders continued into the next year. In March of 63, 69-year-old Mary Brown was found murdered in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And then in May, 23-year-old Beverly Sammons was killed in her apartment near Harvard University. The fact that the murders were spreading to surrounding towns only amplified the sense of dread. It felt like the killer had no boundaries, no limits.
It's like a horror movie coming to life. You mentioned earlier that the lack of a consistent MO had some experts thinking that there might be multiple killers involved. Did that theory gain more traction as the murders continued?
It did. As investigators analyzed the crime scenes, they noticed variations in the way the victims were bound, the types of ligatures used, even the positions the bodies were left in. These inconsistencies were difficult to reconcile with the idea of a single killer, especially one operating with a level of precision and control, often seen in serial killer cases.
Okay, so the case is getting more complex. The fear is spreading. And then on September 8th, 1963, we have another victim, Murray Corbin, 57, found murdered in Salem, Massachusetts.
This marked the 11th victim officially linked to the Boston Strangler. And at this point, the idea of a single prolific serial killer was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. The pressure on law enforcement was immense.
I can only imagine. But even with that pressure, the murders continued. On November 23rd, 1963, 23-year-old Joanne Graff was found strangled in her apartment in Lawrence, Massachusetts.
This case in many ways mirrored the previous ones. No signs of forced entry, the same chilling MO. It felt like the killer was operating with impunity, almost daring the authorities to catch them.
And then the final victim, The one whose case would eventually provide a major breakthrough, but not for several decades. 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, found murdered in her apartment on Charles Street on January 4th, 1964. This case, more than any other, would become synonymous with the Boston Strangler.
But before we get to that, we need to talk about the man who would confess to being the Boston Strangler, the man whose name would become inextricably linked to this case, Albert DeSalvo.
All right, let's talk about DeSalvo.
In 1964, DeSalvo was arrested for a series of sexual assaults, completely unrelated to the Boston Strangler case. But while he was in custody, he confessed to being the Boston Strangler. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so DeSalvo confesses. Case closed, right?
Not quite. DeSalvo's confession is a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it's also the beginning of a whole new set of questions and doubts. Because as we dig deeper, you'll see that things aren't as straightforward as they might seem.
This is where the real deep dive begins. We've got the backdrop, the terror that gripped Boston, the seemingly random victims, and now we have a confession. But how reliable is that confession? What evidence supports it, and what evidence contradicts it? We'll unravel it all right after this.
We left off with Albert DeSalvo's confession. Now, I'm guessing you're thinking a confession is pretty much an open and shut case, right? You'd think so. But it's actually where the intrigue really begins.
Let's unpack that. What made people doubt DeSalvo's confession, even at the time?
Well, for starters, there was the issue of his personality. Those who knew DeSalvo, people who interacted with him regularly, they insisted that he simply wasn't capable of the level of violence associated with the Boston Strangler murders. They described him as a petty criminal, a con man, someone who sought attention, but not someone capable of such brutality.
So the image they had of him just didn't line up with the image of a cold-blooded killer. That makes sense. But wouldn't a confession override personal opinions?
In this case, it's not so simple. Remember those inconsistencies we talked about earlier? The variations in the murders, the different methods of killing, the different types of victims. Well, inconsistencies played a major role in fueling those doubts. A lot of experts, including former FBI profiler Robert Ressler, argued that it's extremely rare for a single serial killer to deviate so drastically from their established MO.
So maybe these weren't all the work of a single person. Maybe there was more than one killer operating in Boston at the time.
That's a theory that gained a lot of traction. And it wasn't just based on the inconsistencies in the crimes. There were other factors at play, too. For instance, Dr. Ames Roby, the medical director at Bridgewater State Hospital where DeSalvo was being held, publicly stated that he believed DeSalvo was a compulsive confessor, someone who craved attention and notoriety.
So the idea is that DeSalvo saw an opportunity to become infamous, to be the Boston Strangler everyone was talking about.
Exactly. And keep in mind, he was already serving a life sentence for those sexual assault charges. Confessing to the Boston Strangler murders wouldn't add any additional time to his sentence, but it would definitely make him the center of attention.
That's fascinating. It adds a whole new psychological dimension to the case. Are there any accounts that support this idea of DeSalvo seeking fame?
There are. In fact, a former inmate who served time with DeSalvo, George Harrison, claimed that he overheard another inmate coaching DeSalvo on details of the murders, essentially feeding him information to make his confession more convincing.
Wow. That's a pretty explosive claim. So now we have the possibility that DeSalvo wasn't acting alone, that he might have been manipulated or even encouraged to confess falsely.
It certainly complicates the narrative. And then we have the work of Susan Kelly, a journalist and author who dedicated years to investigating the Boston Strangler case. Her book, The Boston Stranglers, puts forward a compelling argument that the murders were not the work of a single individual, but rather the work of several different killers operating independently.
I've heard about that book. She really dug deep into the case, didn't she?
She did. Kelly spent years poring over case files, interviewing witnesses, meticulously analyzing every detail. And her conclusion was that the evidence simply didn't support the idea of a single killer.
Her work really challenged the accepted narrative, didn't it? It must have been pretty groundbreaking at the time.
It was. And she wasn't alone in her skepticism. Even Johnny Deblis, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling at the FBI, expressed doubts about DeSalvo's involvement. After studying the case, Douglas concluded that DeSalvo's personality and motivations didn't align with the brutality and seemingly random nature of the Boston Strangler murders.
So we have doubts coming from people who knew DeSalvo personally, doubts from medical professionals, doubts from investigative journalists, and doubts from top FBI profilers. It paints a very different picture than the one presented by DeSalvo's confession.
It does, and for a long time, these doubts lingered, creating a sense of unease and uncertainty around the case.
But then, in 2013, there's a major development, a breakthrough that seemed to finally confirm DeSalvo's connection to at least one of the murders.
This is where the story takes another turn, and it all comes down to the power of DNA technology.
All right, let's talk about the DNA evidence.
In 2013, investigators were finally able to use advanced DNA testing to analyze evidence from the crime scene of Mary Sullivan, the final victim, and what they found was a near-perfect match to Y DNA taken from a nephew of Albert DeSalvo.
Now, for those of us who aren't forensic scientists, can you explain what Y-DNA is and why it's so important in this case?
Sure. Y DNA is a type of DNA that is passed down through the male line from father to son. So the fact that there was a match between the DNA found at the crime scene and the DNA of DeSalvo's nephew strongly suggested that DeSalvo was indeed present at the scene of Mary Sullivan's murder.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. So even though DeSalvo had been dead for decades, they were still able to use DNA technology to connect him to the crime scene.
Exactly. It was a remarkable feat of forensic science. And to get even more definitive proof, they decided to exhume DeSalvo's body and compare his DNA directly to the evidence from the crime scene.
I remember hearing about that. It was big news at the time. So what did the results show?
The results confirmed what the Y-DNA testing had suggested. DeSalvo was the source of seminal fluid found on Mary Sullivan's body and at the crime scene. It was a major breakthrough in the case, seemingly providing concrete evidence to support DeSalvo's confession, at least in connection to Mary Sullivan's murder.
So, case closed, right?
Well, not exactly. While the DNA evidence solidified DeSalvo's connection to Mary Sullivan's murder, it didn't necessarily prove he was responsible for all the others. Remember, there were 13 victims in total.
Right. So even with this seemingly irrefutable DNA evidence, the debate didn't end. There were still those who believed DeSalvo wasn't the Boston Strangler, at least not alone.
Exactly. And their argument is understandable. The doubts we discussed earlier, the inconsistencies in the crimes, the lack of physical evidence connecting DeSalvo to the other murders, those questions haven't magically disappeared.
It's almost like we're right back where we started. We have a confession. We have DNA evidence linking DeSalvo to one of the murders. But we also have a lot of unanswered questions and conflicting evidence. That suggests the possibility of multiple killers, or even a false confession. It's enough to make your head spin.
It's a complex and nuanced situation for sure. But that's what makes this case so fascinating. Even with advancements in forensic science and criminal profiling, there are still aspects of this case that remain shrouded in mystery.
It makes you wonder, if not DeSalvo alone, then who else? What other motives or connections were there that maybe investigators missed all those years ago?
That's the question. That keeps researchers and armchair detectives coming back to this case. There's a human element here that goes beyond just the facts and the evidence. This case tapped into primal fears, the idea of a predator lurking in the shadows, striking seemingly at random. It's a story about fear, uncertainty, and the very human need to find answers, even when those answers are elusive.
It makes you realize this isn't just some cold case file. It's a story that reflects deeper anxieties about safety, about the darkness that can exist even in familiar places.
And the cultural impact of the Boston Strangler case speaks volumes about that. Think about it. Books, documentaries, even feature films, like the 1968 film with Tony Curtis as DeSalvo, or the more recent one from 2023 starring Keira Knightley.
And those aren't even the only examples. You've got the Standell song, Dirty Water, with its reference to the Strangler. Then there was Andrew Toney, that Philadelphia 76ers player in the 80s, who was nicknamed the Boston Strangler because of his defense against the Celtics.
These cultural touchstones really underscore just how deeply this case resonated with the public. It became a sort of cautionary tale, a reminder of the vulnerability we all face, and the enduring mystery of the human heart.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this chilling case, let's recap what we've learned. We explored the series of murders that terrorized Boston, leaving a city grasping for answers. We grappled with the complexities of Albert DeSalvo's confession, a confession riddled with doubts and inconsistencies. We even unearthed the power and the limits of DNA evidence, a tool that both illuminated and obscured the truth.
We also saw the tireless efforts of those like Lane Sharp, who refused to accept easy answers and continue to seek justice, even when faced with seemingly irrefutable evidence.
And what I find most compelling is this. Even with all the advancements in forensic science and investigative techniques, there's still an aura of mystery that hangs over this case. It's a reminder that some stories defy simple explanations, that truth can be elusive, and that sometimes the most compelling mysteries are those that leave us with more questions than answers.
The Boston Strangler case challenges us to think critically. to question assumptions, to consider multiple perspectives, and to acknowledge that even with our best efforts, some truths may remain forever out of reach.
So as we leave this deep dive, I'll leave you with this final thought. What do you believe happened? Was DeSalvo a lone wolf, driven by dark impulses? Or was there a more complex narrative at play? A conspiracy, perhaps? Or a web of interconnected events that led to these tragic deaths? Maybe someday we'll have definitive answers. Or maybe the mystery itself is what will continue to fascinate and haunt us for generations to come. So we were talking about Elaine Sharp and her efforts to clear DeSalvo's name. What was it about the case that made her believe in his innocence, even after that 2013 DNA evidence?
Well, Elaine Sharp represented the DeSalvo family. She also worked with the family of Mary Sullivan, spending years trying to prove DeSalvo wasn't the Boston Strangler. Sharp meticulously combed through those case files, and what she found were several discrepancies between what DeSalvo confessed to and the actual forensic evidence from the crime scenes. For instance, certain acts DeSalvo claimed to have committed with Mary Sullivan just didn't line up with what the forensics showed.
So even with the DNA placing him at the scene of Mary Sullivan's murder, some of his confession details didn't add up. I guess that's why the debate goes on. Some see that DNA as proof positive. Others say it only solves one piece of a much bigger, more complex puzzle.
Right. It raises the question, if those details in his confession were wrong, could other parts be fabricated too? And if so, why? Was he pressured? Was there another motive? Or, as some people believe, were other people involved in some of these murders?
It really highlights the limits of even what we think of as conclusive evidence. DNA can place someone at a scene, but it can't tell the whole story. It can't reveal intent or coercion, or the involvement of others.
Exactly, and that's what keeps this case so captivating, even decades later. We have forensic advancements, criminal profiling, all these tools. But the Boston Strangler case still holds on to its secrets, refusing to fit neatly into any single explanation.
It makes you wonder, if not DeSalvo alone, then who else? What other motives or connections were there that maybe investigators missed all those years ago?
That's the question that keeps researchers and armchair detectives coming back to this case. There's a human element here that goes beyond just the facts and the evidence. This case tapped into primal fears, the idea of a predator lurking in the shadows, striking seemingly at random. It's a story about fear, uncertainty, and the very human need to find answers, even when those answers are elusive.
It makes you realize this isn't just some cold case file. It's a story that reflects those deeper anxieties about safety, about the darkness that can exist even in familiar places.
Absolutely.
So we've gone through a lot today. We've explored those early days of terror in Boston. We grappled with the complexities of DeSalvo's confession. And we even saw how DNA evidence both clarified and complicated the case. But ultimately, the Boston Strangler case remains an enigma, a chilling reminder that some mysteries may never be fully solved.
And perhaps that's what makes it so enduringly fascinating. It challenges us to confront the unknown, to grapple with uncertainty, and to acknowledge that sometimes the search for truth is just as important as the answers themselves.
Well said. We hope you found this deep dive into the Boston Strangler case both informative and thought-provoking. And who knows, maybe someday new evidence will emerge, shedding light on those unanswered questions. Until then, the mystery endures.